The wedding dress felt like a costume borrowed from someone else's life. Elena Grant stood in front of a mirror in a room she did not recognize, in a house that was not her own, and watched a stranger stare back at her. She was 17 years old. In 4 hours, she would belong to a man she had met only twice. Her mother stood behind her, fixing the last pin in her hair with trembling fingers. Neither of them spoke about the truth sitting heavy in the room. The truth was simple and cruel. Elena's father owed money to powerful people, and Richard Ashford's family had offered to make the debt disappear in exchange for a wedding. Elena was the payment. "He is a good family," her mother whispered, more to convince herself than her daughter.
"The Ashfords are respected everywhere."
"You will want for nothing." Elena did not answer. She had learned, over the past 3 weeks, that silence was easier than arguing with something that could not be changed. The wedding took place in a stone chapel on the Ashford estate, surrounded by guests Elena had never seen before. Richard Ashford stood at the altar in a dark suit, tall and unreadable, his eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder the entire ceremony. He was 26, 9 years older than her, and when the priest instructed him to take her hand, he did it the way a man signs a contract he has already decided he dislikes. There was no warmth in his voice when he said his vows. There was no warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, briefly, before looking away again. Elena said her own vows in a steady voice, though her hands shook the entire time. She had promised herself she would not cry in front of these people. She kept that promise, barely. After the ceremony, a car took them to the main house, a mansion so large that Elena lost count of the windows before they even reached the front steps. Staff lined the entrance, dressed in black and white, watching the new bride, with expressions she could not read. Curiosity, pity, something colder. An older woman with sharp eyes and silver hair stepped forward first. "I am Mrs. Whitfield," she said. "I manage the household. If you need anything, you may ask me." Elena thanked her, grateful for the one kind face in the crowd. Richard walked past all of it, without introducing her to anyone else. He simply said, "She will need a room," and disappeared into the house, leaving Elena standing alone on the steps of a home that was now supposedly hers. Mrs. Whitfield led her inside instead, showing her to a bedroom on the 2nd floor, far from the master suite. "Mr. Ashford keeps his own rooms," the housekeeper explained carefully. "You will have this wing." Elena understood the message without needing it explained further. This was not a marriage built on closeness. This was an arrangement, and she was expected to stay in her assigned place within it. That evening, she was told to dress for dinner. The dining room was enormous, with a table long enough to seat 20, though only 3 places were set. Richard sat at the head. An older man sat to his right, watching Elena with sharp, intelligent eyes as she entered. "This is my grandfather," Richard said, without looking up from his plate. "Duke Edmund Ashford." The old man rose slightly from his chair, a gesture of respect that surprised Elena more than anything else that day. "Sit, child," he said, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. "You must be exhausted." His voice was warm, in a way nothing else in that house had been. Elena sat, and for the first time since the wedding began, she allowed herself to breathe. Dinner passed mostly in silence, broken only by the Duke asking Elena small questions about her family, her childhood, the town she came from. Richard said almost nothing, eating quickly and excusing himself before dessert was served. Elena watched him go, feeling something settle uncomfortably in her chest. Whatever this marriage was supposed to be, it was clear Richard had no intention of pretending otherwise. "Do not mind my grandson," the Duke said once Richard had left the room. "He carries more weight than people realize." That does not excuse his manners, but it may explain them. Elena did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing. The Duke studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies something he is trying to understand. "You are frightened," he said finally. It was not a question. "I am adjusting," Elena answered carefully. The Duke almost smiled. "A diplomatic answer. Good. You will need diplomacy in this house." He rose from the table slowly, leaning on a cane Elena had not noticed before. "Sleep well, child. Tomorrow this house will feel a little less like a stranger's home, I promise you that." Elena returned to her room that night and sat by the window for a long time. looking out over gardens she could barely see in the darkness. She thought about her mother's words. She thought about her father's debts. She thought about the man downstairs who had married her without ever once looking her fully in the eyes. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not, and she intended to keep that promise for as long as she possibly could. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. Richard left early each morning for the family's business offices in the city and returned late, often after Elena had already gone to bed. When their paths did cross, his politeness was thin and automatic, the kind offered to guests rather than a wife. He asked how she was settling in. He never waited long enough to hear the full answer. Elena filled her days by exploring the house, learning its long hallways and quiet rooms, and by spending time with the Duke, who seemed to genuinely enjoy her company, in a way no one else in the household did. He told her stories about the estate, about his own younger years, about the family businesses that stretched from shipping to textiles to land holdings across 3 counties. Elena listened carefully, asking questions when she did not understand something, and the Duke seemed pleased each time she did. "You have a sharp mind," he told her one afternoon, as they walked slowly through the gardens together. "Sharper than most people who are handed everything without having to earn it." "I was not handed anything," Elena said quietly, before she could stop herself. "I was given away." The words hung in the air between them. She expected the Duke to be offended, or to correct her. Instead, he nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said, "I know that as well as you do. It does not make it right, but it does not have to be the end of your story either." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "This family has more power than it deserves, and less wisdom than it needs. Perhaps you are here to change that balance." Elena did not fully understand what he meant, not yet, but she held on to the words anyway, turning them over in her mind long after the conversation ended, the first seed of something that had not existed in her before. Hope, cautious and small, but present all the same. That night, as she sat by her window again, watching the last light fade over the gardens, Elena made herself a quiet promise. She did not know what kind of life waited for her inside these walls. She did not know if Richard would ever look at her the way a husband should look at his wife, but she knew she would not spend the rest of her life being small in a house built for people who thought she did not belong. Whatever came next, she would meet it standing up straight. She had no way of knowing, as she finally closed her eyes that night, just how soon that promise would be tested, or how much the house around her was about to change. The car pulled up outside the Ashford estate on a gray afternoon, 3 months after Elena's wedding. She was crossing the hall when she heard it. Tires on gravel, a door closing, and then Richard's voice, low and hurried, speaking to someone the way he never spoke to her. Elena reached the window in time to see a woman step out of the car. She was beautiful, in a polished, deliberate way, dressed in a coat that cost more than everything in Elena's closet combined. Richard stood beside her, carrying her bags himself, something Elena had never once seen him do for anyone. Mrs. Whitfield appeared beside Elena, her face carefully blank. "Mrs. Ashford," she said quietly, "perhaps you should sit down." "Who is she?" Elena asked, though some part of her already understood the answer before it came. "Her name is Camille Voss," Mrs. Whitfield said. "She and Mr. Ashford have known each other for a long time." The word known hung heavy in the air. Elena did not need it explained further. She had heard whispers among the staff before, fragments of conversation that stopped the moment she entered a room, but she had told herself they meant nothing. Now the truth was standing in the driveway, in an expensive coat, smiling as Richard opened the front door for her. Elena met them in the entrance hall, standing straight, refusing to let her hands shake the way they wanted to. Richard's expression flickered with something close to discomfort when he saw her, but it disappeared quickly, replaced by the same flat politeness he offered everyone. "Elena," he said, "this is Camille. She will be staying with us for a while." Camille's eyes moved over Elena slowly, taking in every detail, from her plain dress to the way she stood too still, too careful. There was no cruelty in her expression, which somehow made it worse. There was only mild interest, the kind a person might show toward furniture that did not quite match the room. "How lovely," Camille said, her voice smooth as silk. "Richard mentioned you were young. He did not mention how young." Elena forced herself to keep her chin level. "Welcome to the house," she said, and though the words nearly broke apart in her throat, she delivered them without a single crack showing. That night, Elena learned that Camille had been given a room in the East Wing, not far from Richard's own quarters, far closer than Elena's room ever had been. She learned this from Mrs. Whitfield, who delivered the information with obvious discomfort, as though she wished she did not have to say it at all. "Does the Duke know?" Elena asked. "The Duke knows everything that happens in this house," Mrs. Whitfield said carefully. "What he chooses to do about it is a different matter entirely." Elena did not sleep well that night. She lay awake, listening to the house settle around her, imagining Camille's laughter somewhere down the hall, imagining Richard's attention finally landing somewhere it seemed to want to be. She thought about her mother's promise that she would want for nothing in this marriage. She had not understood, back then, that some kinds of poverty had nothing to do with money. The following weeks confirmed what Elena had feared. Camille did not hide her place in the household. She joined meals uninvited, seated herself at Richard's side without asking, and spoke to the staff as though she, not Elena, held authority in the home. Richard did nothing to correct any of it. If anything, his silence seemed to give Camille permission to expand further, claiming more space with each passing day. Elena tried, at first, to simply endure it. She kept to her wing of the house, ate her meals quietly, and avoided situations where Camille's presence might sting the sharpest. But avoidance only went so far in a house, where every hallway seemed to lead back to the same two people, laughing softly together in rooms Elena was not welcome to enter. The breaking point came during a dinner 3 weeks after Camille's arrival. The Duke was traveling on estate business and would not return for several days, leaving the dining room without the one presence that usually tempered the worst of the household's cruelty. Camille arrived at the table already seated in Elena's usual chair, beside Richard, sipping wine as though she had always belonged there. "I hope you don't mind," Camille said, not looking up. "Richard and I have business to discuss." It seemed easier to sit together. Elena stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling every eye in the room, including the staff serving dinner, waiting to see what she would do. She could have argued. She could have demanded her place at the table the way any wife might. Instead, she chose the seat across from them, quiet and composed, refusing to give either of them the satisfaction of a reaction. "Of course," she said simply. "I hope the business goes well." Camille's eyes narrowed slightly, as though she had expected a different response and was unsure what to make of the one she received. Richard, for his part, said nothing at all, focusing on his plate the entire meal, unwilling to meet Elena's eyes even once. It was during that dinner, watching the two of them speak in low voices about numbers and contracts, Elena did not fully understand, that something shifted inside her. She realized, with sudden clarity, that her sadness would change nothing. Her silence would change nothing. If she wanted a different place in this house, she would have to build it herself, brick by brick, with nothing handed to her. The next morning, Elena rose earlier than usual and made her way to the estate's private library, a room she had rarely visited beyond admiring its shelves. She began pulling books, not novels or poetry, but records. Ledgers from the family's businesses, correspondence about their land holdings, old newspapers detailing the Ashford family's various enterprises across the decades. She did not fully understand most of what she read, but she read anyway, page after page, determined to understand the world she had been placed inside of. Mrs. Whitfield found her there hours later, surrounded by open books, ink-stained fingers pressed against her temples in concentration. "Mrs. Ashford," the housekeeper said gently, "may I ask what you are doing?" "Learning," Elena answered simply, not lifting her eyes from the page in front of her. "No one gave me a place in this family. I intend to earn one instead." Mrs. Whitfield studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering across her usually guarded expression. "If you would like," she said carefully, "I could arrange for you to sit with Mr. Cole, the family's lawyer, when he visits next week. He handles much of the estate's paperwork. He might answer some of your questions more clearly than these old books can." Elena looked up, surprised by the offer. "Why would you help me with this?" The housekeeper hesitated before answering. "Because in 20 years of service to this family, you are the first person to walk into this house and ask to understand it, rather than simply take from it." She gave a small, careful smile. "That is not nothing, Mrs. Ashford." Elena spent the following days preparing for the meeting with Mr. Cole, reading everything she could find, forming questions she hoped would not sound foolish. Camille, meanwhile, continued to move through the house as though she already owned it, and Richard continued to allow it. His silence, a wound Elena was slowly learning to stop reopening every single day. The Duke returned from his travels a week later, arriving in the late afternoon, with the same quiet authority he carried into every room. He found Elena in the library again, this time with Mr. Cole seated across from her, papers spread between them, as she asked careful, pointed questions about the family's shipping contracts. He did not interrupt. He stood in the doorway for several minutes, watching, before finally stepping inside, once Mr. Cole had gathered his papers to leave. "You have been busy in my absence," the Duke said, settling into a chair near the window. "I did not want to remain a stranger in my own home any longer," Elena replied. The Duke's eyes moved over her carefully, taking in the ink on her fingers, the determination in her posture, the way she had clearly not slept enough, but had not let that stop her either. "I heard about the dinner," he said quietly. "Well, I was away." Elena's stomach tightened. "It was not important." "I disagree," the Duke said. "I think it was the most important dinner that has happened in this house, in a very long time." He leaned forward slightly, his cane resting against his knee. "You did not break, child. Many women in your position would have. Some might say they should not have had to endure such a thing in the first place, and they would be right. But you did not break. That tells me something worth knowing." Elena did not know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded, holding his gaze steadily. "I am old," the Duke continued, "and I have watched this family make the same mistakes for 3 generations. Wealth without wisdom, power without patience. I had begun to think the pattern would never break." He studied her for a long moment. "Perhaps I was wrong." He rose slowly, gathering his cane, preparing to leave the room. At the doorway, he paused and turned back to her. "Continue your studies, Elena," he said. "I will make certain Mr. Cole makes time for you, whenever you need it, and I will speak with the household staff. Whatever difficulties exist in this house, you should not have to navigate them entirely alone." After he left, Elena sat alone in the library for a long while, the weight of his words settling slowly over her. For the first time since her wedding day, she did not feel like a stranger being tolerated inside someone else's life. She felt, for the smallest moment, like she might actually belong somewhere. She did not know yet how much that feeling would be tested in the months ahead, or how far Camille was willing to go to make certain Elena never felt it again. But that night, for the first time in months, she slept without lying awake, listening for laughter down the hall. It was a small victory, but it was hers, earned rather than given. And that made it matter more than anything anyone had handed her since the day she arrived. A month after the Duke's return, Elena found herself sitting in on her first real business meeting. It had started small, an invitation for Mr. Cole to review a shipping contract that needed a second set of eyes, and had grown into something larger without Elena quite noticing the shift. She spent her mornings with the estate's ledgers, her afternoons asking Mr. Cole questions, and her evenings reading through old correspondence, piecing together the shape of a business empire she was slowly learning to understand. Camille noticed the change immediately, and she did not like it. "You spend a great deal of time with old papers," Camille remarked one afternoon, finding Elena in the library, surrounded by ledgers as usual. Her tone was light, almost teasing, but her eyes were sharp. "Does Richard know his wife has taken up bookkeeping as a hobby?" "Richard knows what he chooses to know," Elena replied evenly, not looking up from the page in front of her. Camille's smile thinned. She crossed the room slowly, trailing a finger along the edge of the desk. "You should be careful," she said, her voice dropping lower. "Ambition does not suit every woman. Some of us are simply not built for it." "I suppose we will find out which one I am," Elena said, finally lifting her eyes to meet Camille's directly. "In time." For a moment, something flickered across Camille's expression, something close to uncertainty, quickly smoothed away, and replaced with practiced composure. She left the library without another word, but Elena noticed, in the days that followed, a shift in Camille's behavior. The teasing comments grew sharper. The small humiliations grew more frequent, arranged just carefully enough that they could always be explained away as accidents or misunderstandings. Dresses meant for Elena arrived from the tailor altered without her permission, styles chosen that made her look younger and plainer than she was. Invitations to social gatherings that should have included her mysteriously never reached her hands, though Camille always seemed to know about them in perfect detail. Staff members who had grown warm toward Elena found themselves reassigned to duties that kept them far from her company, a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. Elena said nothing to Richard about any of it. She had learned, in the months since her wedding, that raising concerns with her husband accomplished nothing except further silence. Instead, she began keeping careful records of her own, small notes in a private journal, dates and details she did not yet know what to do with, but felt instinctively she should not forget. It was during this period that Elena made her first real discovery in the ledgers, one that would change the course of everything that followed. She had been reviewing the accounts for the family's textile business, a smaller operation compared to the shipping and land holdings but still significant, when she noticed a discrepancy. A shipment of raw materials, recorded as delivered and paid for in full, did not match the corresponding invoice from the supplier. The numbers were close enough that a casual glance would miss it entirely, but Elena had spent weeks training her eyes to catch exactly this kind of inconsistency. She brought the discrepancy to Mr. Cole the following morning, laying out both documents side by side on his desk. "This delivery was recorded as complete," she said, pointing to the ledger entry. "But the supplier's invoice shows only half the material was ever shipped. Either someone made an error, or someone paid for goods that were never received." Mr. Cole studied the documents for a long moment, his expression growing increasingly serious. "Mrs. Ashford," he said finally, "do you understand what you may have found here?" "I believe I do," Elena said carefully, "but I would rather you confirm it than assume I am correct." Mr. Cole spent the next 2 days investigating the discrepancy quietly, tracing it back through several months of records. What he uncovered was worse than either of them had expected. The textile business's manager, a man Richard had trusted and left largely unsupervised for years, had been quietly diverting funds through falsified shipments, pocketing the difference between what was recorded and what was actually delivered. The losses, spread carefully across many months to avoid detection, totaled a significant sum. When Mr. Cole brought the findings to Richard, Elena was present in the room, though she said nothing at first, waiting to see how her husband would respond. Richard's reaction was a mixture of anger and disbelief, directed first at the manager, then, uncomfortably, at himself. "How long has this been happening?" he demanded. "Nearly 2 years, by our estimate," Mr. Cole said. "It is a significant loss, though not one that threatens the business as a whole. It could have been caught much sooner, had someone been reviewing the accounts more closely." Richard's jaw tightened. He glanced at Elena, seeming to notice, for the first time in a long while, that she was actually in the room. "You found this?" he asked, his tone somewhere between surprise and something Elena could not quite name. "I did," Elena said simply. "I have been studying the ledgers. I thought it would help me understand the family's affairs better." Richard did not respond immediately. Something passed across his face, quick and complicated, gone before Elena could fully read it. "Thank you," he said finally, the words stiff and unfamiliar in his mouth, as though he rarely had cause to use them. "This could have cost us far more, left unchecked." It was not warmth. It was not the beginning of the marriage Elena had once, foolishly, hoped for. But it was acknowledgement, the first real acknowledgement Richard had given her since their wedding day, and Elena found herself holding on to it more tightly than she expected. Word of the discovery spread quietly through the household staff over the following days, the way such things always did. Elena noticed a shift in how people treated her, small but unmistakable. Mrs. Whitfield began consulting her on household matters she previously would have handled alone. The younger staff greeted her with genuine warmth, rather than cautious politeness. Even Henry, the estate's reserved and formal butler, began addressing her with a level of respect he had never shown before. Camille noticed the shift as well, and it seemed to unsettle her more than anything that had come before. "You've made quite an impression," Camille said one evening, finding Elena in the garden, where she had taken to walking in the quiet hours before dinner. Her voice carried none of its usual teasing lightness. "Careful, little wife. People in this house have short memories for kindness and long memories for ambition." "Is that a warning?" Elena asked, meeting Camille's gaze steadily. It's advice, Camille said, though her smile suggested otherwise. You should enjoy your small victory while it lasts. Richard's attention is a fickle thing. I would know better than most. Elena said nothing in response, simply holding Camille's gaze until the other woman turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the garden path. Elena stood alone for a long moment afterward, feeling the truth of the exchange settle over her. Whatever ground she had gained, Camille had no intention of surrendering hers without a fight. The Duke summoned Elena to his study a few days later, the discovery of the textile losses clearly having reached his ears as well. He was seated by the fireplace when she arrived, a stack of papers on the table beside him, his expression thoughtful. "Sit, child," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Once she had settled, he studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "You have caused quite a stir in this house." "I did not intend to cause any trouble," Elena said carefully. "You did not cause trouble," the Duke corrected. "You uncovered trouble that was already there, hidden by people who should have known better. There is a difference, and I suspect you understand that difference quite well." Elena allowed herself a small measure of relief at his words. "Thank you," she said. "I only wanted to understand this family's affairs. I did not expect to find anything like that. Most people who go looking for understanding find more than they bargained for," the Duke said, a hint of dry humor in his voice. "That is usually how the most important discoveries happen." He leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more serious. "I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." "Of course," Elena said. "Do you intend to continue this work? The ledgers, the meetings with Mr. Cole, the slow education you have been giving yourself in the family's affairs? Or was this a single act, born from circumstance, that you intend to set aside now that it has served its purpose?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering. She thought about the months of quiet study, the satisfaction of finally understanding something in a house that had once felt entirely foreign to her, the small but real respect she had begun earning from people who had once looked at her with pity. She thought about Camille's warning in the garden, and the fear underneath it that told Elena more than the words themselves ever could. "I intend to continue," Elena said finally. "This house does not feel like mine yet, but understanding it is the first step toward making it so." The Duke's expression shifted into something that, on a face as reserved as his, might have been called genuine pride. "Good," he said simply, "because I have decided to begin involving you more directly in the family's affairs, not as a formality, but as someone whose judgment I intend to rely on." Elena's breath caught slightly. "Richard will not approve of that." "Richard," the Duke said, with a weight that suggested far more than the single word implied, "has a great deal to learn about what this family actually needs, and who is capable of providing it. He will come to understand that, in time, one way or another." He rose slowly from his chair, signaling the conversation's end. "For now, prepare yourself, Elena. I intend to keep you very busy in the months ahead." Elena left the study that evening, with a strange mixture of excitement and unease settling in her chest. She had come to this house as a frightened girl, with no voice and no place, given away to settle a debt she had no part in creating. Slowly, deliberately, she was carving out something different for herself, something built entirely on her own effort. But she was not foolish enough to believe that progress would go unchallenged. Camille had made her feelings clear enough in the garden, and somewhere beneath Richard's stiff gratitude, Elena sensed a discomfort that had not yet decided what shape it would eventually take. Whatever came next, she understood now, would not be given to her gently. She would have to fight for every inch of ground she gained in this house, the same way she had fought for the small victories that had brought her this far. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was no longer afraid of that fight. Winter arrived early that year, settling over the Ashford estate in a gray stillness that seemed to match the growing tension inside its walls. Elena had spent the past 2 months deeply involved in the family's business affairs, sitting in on meetings with Mr. Cole, reviewing contracts, and slowly earning a seat at a table she once would never have imagined belonging to. The Duke had kept his promise, involving her in decisions large and small, teaching her patiently in the evenings, when the rest of the house had gone quiet. But the Duke himself had begun to change as well, and not in a way anyone welcomed. Elena noticed it first in small things, a slight tremor in his hand as he poured tea, A pause, longer than usual, before he answered a question, a fatigue that settled over him earlier in the evenings than it once had. She said nothing at first, uncertain if she was simply imagining changes that were not truly there. But when Dr. Bennett began visiting the estate with increasing frequency, his black bag in hand, his expression carefully neutral each time he left the Duke's study, Elena understood that something serious was happening. His heart, Mrs. Whitfield told her quietly one afternoon, when Elena finally worked up the courage to ask. The doctor says it is weakening, slowly, but weakening all the same. The Duke does not wish it discussed openly. He does not want the household treating him as though he were already gone. Elena absorbed this news with a heaviness she had not expected to feel so deeply. The Duke had become, in the month since her wedding, the closest thing to family she had in this cold, sprawling house. The thought of losing him settled over her like a stone she could not quite put down. She found him in his study that evening, seated by the fire as always, a book open in his lap though his eyes were fixed somewhere far beyond its pages. "You look troubled, child," he said, without looking up. "I heard about your health," Elena said carefully, settling into the chair across from him. "I am sorry. I did not mean to pry." The Duke closed his book slowly and set it aside. "There is no need for secrecy between us, Elena. Not anymore." He studied her for a long moment. "I am dying. Slowly, the doctor tells me. Though slowly is a relative word at my age. It changes how a man thinks about the time he has left, and what he intends to do with it." Elena did not know how to respond to something so direct, so she simply listened, allowing him to continue. "I have watched this family for over 60 years, the Duke said. I have watched wealth pass from careful hands to careless ones, watched businesses built with great effort crumble under poor management, watched people forget that power, without responsibility, is nothing but a slow kind of ruin." He paused, his eyes settling on Elena with unusual intensity. "I do not intend to let that happen again, not with what I have left to give." "What are you saying?" Elena asked quietly, though some part of her had already begun to suspect the answer. "I am saying that I have spent the past several months watching you, testing you, in ways you may not have fully realized," the Duke said. "And I have found, in you, exactly what this family has been missing for 3 generations. Judgment. Patience. A willingness to learn rather than assume you already know everything. Richard has many strengths, Elena, but those are not among them, and I fear they never will be." Elena's heart began to beat faster, though she could not yet name why. "Richard is your heir," she said carefully. "This family's future belongs to him." "Family and fortune are not always the same inheritance," the Duke said. "I intend to see that the parts of this family worth preserving are placed into hands capable of preserving them. Whether that inheritance flows through Richard, or through someone standing beside him, has not yet been decided." The weight of his words settled slowly over Elena, heavier than anything he had said to her before. She understood, with sudden clarity, that the Duke was not simply teaching her out of kindness or curiosity. He was preparing her for something far larger, something that would upend the entire structure of the family she had married into. "Does Richard know you are considering this?" she asked. "Not yet," the Duke said, "though I suspect, in time, he will need to. There are matters closer to home that require attention first." Elena understood immediately what he meant. "Camille," she said quietly. The Duke's expression darkened slightly. "I have had Mr. Cole conducting a quiet investigation, separate from the textile matter you uncovered. Miss Voss has been in this family's orbit for longer than most people realize, and her presence has never been without cost, financial or otherwise." He reached for a folder resting on the table beside him and handed it to Elena. "Read this, when you have a quiet moment. I believe it will explain a great deal about the woman currently residing in my grandson's household." Elena opened the folder later that night, alone in her room, and read through pages of careful documentation that Mr. Cole had assembled over weeks of quiet inquiry. Camille's relationship with Richard, it turned out, predated Elena's marriage by nearly 3 years, a fact Elena had already suspected but never confirmed. More troubling were the financial details woven throughout the pages. Gifts of jewelry and property, arranged through accounts Richard controlled personally, separate from the family's official ledgers. Payments to a business Camille claimed to own, though further investigation revealed the business existed largely on paper, generating far more expense than income. A pattern, carefully constructed over years, of a woman who had learned exactly how to make herself indispensable to a man, unwilling or unable to see the cost of her presence clearly. Elena closed the folder, feeling a strange mixture of anger and something closer to pity. Whatever pain Camille had caused her, whatever cruelty had passed between them in quiet hallways and garden paths, Elena could see now that Camille's position in this house was built on something as fragile and desperate, in its own way, as the arranged marriage that had brought Elena here in the first place. The difference was that Camille had chosen this path deliberately, shaping it to her own advantage at every turn, while Elena had simply been placed inside hers without a say in the matter. The following weeks passed in careful preparation. The Duke continued his quiet investigation, gathering the final pieces of evidence he intended to present when the moment was right. Elena continued her work with Mr. Cole, her understanding of the family's affairs deepening with each passing day, her confidence growing alongside it. Richard remained largely unaware of the storm building beneath the surface of his household, distracted by business matters in the city, and by Camille's carefully maintained presence at home. It was during this period that Elena and Richard had their first real conversation since the discovery of the textile losses, an exchange that neither of them had planned, but that left a lasting impression on both. Elena had been working late in the library one evening, surrounded by her usual collection of ledgers and correspondence, when Richard entered unexpectedly, looking for a book he claimed to need for a meeting the following morning. He paused when he saw her, seeming momentarily uncertain whether to stay or leave. "You work later than most people in this house," he said finally, breaking the silence. "There is a great deal to learn," Elena replied, not looking up from the papers in front of her. Richard lingered near the doorway, an unusual hesitation in his posture. "My grandfather speaks of you often," he said, "more than I expected him to." Elena finally lifted her eyes to meet his. "Does that trouble you?" Richard considered the question longer than she expected him to. "I am not certain," he admitted finally. "It should not trouble me. You have done nothing but help this family since you arrived, and yet—" He stopped, seeming to search for words that did not come easily to him. "I married you as an arrangement, Elena. I never expected you to become someone this house could not function without." "Would you prefer I had remained small and quiet?" Elena asked, an edge creeping into her voice, despite her efforts to keep it steady. "Easier to ignore?" "No," Richard said, more quickly than Elena expected. "No, I would not prefer that." He ran a hand through his hair, an uncharacteristic gesture of frustration. "I do not know what I prefer anymore. This marriage was never supposed to be complicated, and now, it is the most complicated thing in my life." Elena studied him carefully, searching for something honest beneath his usual careful distance. "You brought complication into this house yourself, Richard," she said quietly. "Camille's presence here was your choice, not mine." Richard's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena thought he might argue. Instead, he simply nodded, something heavy and unspoken passing behind his eyes. "I know," he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "I am beginning to understand exactly how much of a mistake that choice may have been." He left the library shortly after, without further explanation, leaving Elena alone with her papers, and a strange, unsettled feeling she could not quite name. Whatever was coming, she understood now, would not remain buried much longer. The careful balance the household had maintained for months was beginning to crack, and everyone inside it, whether they realized it yet or not, was about to be forced into the open. She thought of the Duke's failing health, of the folder full of evidence hidden away in Mr. Cole's office, of Camille's sharp warning in the garden weeks earlier. All of it was building towards something, gathering weight like storm clouds over the estate's quiet grounds. Elena closed her ledger that night and sat for a long while in the darkened library, gathering her own resolve. Whatever confrontation lay ahead, she intended to meet it not as the frightened 17-year-old who had once stood at that altar, but as the woman this house, and this family, had slowly, deliberately, shaped her into becoming. She was ready. She only hoped, when the moment finally arrived, that readiness would be enough. The invitation arrived on heavy cream paper, delivered to every senior member of the Ashford family and its closest business associates. A formal dinner, hosted by the Duke himself, to mark the anniversary of the estate's founding. a tradition observed once every few years, with considerable ceremony. Elena read the invitation twice, before understanding, with a growing sense of unease, that this was no ordinary celebration. "He has chosen his moment," Mr. Cole told her quietly, when she visited his office the following afternoon. "The Duke intends to make certain matters known publicly, in front of witnesses who cannot easily be ignored or dismissed afterward." "Camille," Elena said. "Among other things," Mr. Cole confirmed, his expression grave. "I would advise you to prepare yourself, Mrs. Ashford. Whatever happens at that dinner, it will not be quiet, and it will not be easily undone afterward." The days leading up to the dinner passed in a strange, taut silence throughout the household. Camille, sensing perhaps that something significant was approaching, grew more possessive of Richard's attention, appearing at his side constantly, speaking in low, urgent tones, whenever she believed no one else was listening. Richard, for his part, seemed distracted and uneasy, caught between obligations he did not fully understand, and a growing awareness that something in his carefully maintained arrangement was about to shift beneath him. Elena spent the days preparing in her own quiet way, reviewing documents with Mr. Cole, speaking privately with the Duke about what role, if any, she might play in the evening ahead. "You need not say anything, unless I ask it of you directly," the Duke told her, 2 days before the dinner, as they sat together in his study. His health had continued its slow decline, though his eyes remained as sharp and determined as ever. "Your presence alone will speak clearly enough." "I am not afraid," Elena said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that the words were true. "I know," the Duke said, a faint smile crossing his tired features. "That is precisely why I have chosen to place so much trust in you." The evening of the dinner arrived cold and clear, the estate's dining room transformed with candlelight and polished silver, the long table set for nearly 30 guests, family members and business associates who had traveled considerable distances to attend. Elena dressed carefully, choosing a deep blue gown that Mrs. Whitfield had quietly arranged for her, a departure from the plain, girlish dresses Camille had once ensured filled her wardrobe. When she looked in the mirror, before descending the stairs, she barely recognized the composed, steady woman staring back at her. The dining room buzzed with quiet conversation as guests arrived, greeting one another with the practiced warmth of people accustomed to moving through wealthy circles. Elena took her place near the head of the table, beside the Duke's empty chair, while Richard stood near the entrance, greeting arrivals with Camille positioned deliberately at his side, her hand resting on his arm, in a gesture too intimate for a guest to display so openly. Several guests exchanged glances at the sight, murmurs passing quietly between them, though no one dared comment directly. Elena held her composure, greeting each guest warmly, refusing to let the discomfort show on her face. The Duke entered the room precisely as dinner was announced, moving slowly, with the aid of his cane, but carrying himself with an authority that silenced the room's murmuring the moment he appeared. He took his seat at the head of the table, Elena beside him, and the meal began with the usual formal courses, conversation flowing easily around business matters and family history, the tension beneath the surface hidden carefully from most of the guests. It was not until the final course had been cleared, and the room had settled into the comfortable lull that usually preceded after-dinner conversation, that the Duke rose slowly from his chair, tapping his glass gently for attention. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. "Thank you all for joining us this evening," he began, his voice carrying clearly, despite its age-worn edges. "This estate has stood for nearly a century, built by hands far more capable than mine, and I have spent my life trying to honor the responsibility that inheritance carries. Tonight, I find myself needing to address that responsibility directly, in front of the people who matter most to this family's future." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing toward his grandfather with obvious unease. Camille's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around her wineglass. "Over the past year," the Duke continued, "I have watched this household change in ways both troubling and, ultimately, hopeful. I have watched my grandson allow personal indulgence to compromise the dignity of his marriage and the stability of this family's reputation." His gaze shifted deliberately toward Camille. "And I have watched a woman with no legitimate claim to this family's affairs position herself as though she held one." A ripple of shocked murmurs passed through the guests. Camille's face drained of color, though she maintained her composure with visible effort. "Grandfather," Richard said, his voice tight with warning, "this is not the place." "This is precisely the place," the Duke interrupted, his voice sharp despite its frailty. "You brought this arrangement into full view of this household, Richard. You will not now ask me to hide the consequences of it behind closed doors." Richard fell silent, his jaw clenched, unable to argue further in front of the assembled guests. The Duke turned his attention fully toward Camille, his expression unreadable but firm. "Miss Voss," he said, "I am aware of the financial arrangements you have quietly extracted from this family over the past several years. Gifts, properties, payments, funneled through a business that exists in name only. I am aware, as well, of the position you have attempted to claim within this household, one that was never legitimately yours to hold." Camille's composure finally cracked, her eyes flashing with something between fear and fury. "You cannot simply—" "I can," the Duke said, cutting her off with quiet, unshakable authority. "This is my house, built by my family, and I will not allow it to be quietly hollowed out by someone who mistook affection for entitlement. You will leave this estate by morning, Miss Voss, and any further attempt to extract resources from this family will be met with legal consequence. Mr. Cole has already prepared the necessary documentation." The room had fallen into stunned silence, every guest watching the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and barely concealed fascination. Camille rose from her seat, her hands trembling slightly despite her attempt to maintain dignity. "Richard," she said, turning toward him, her voice edged with desperation, "are you going to allow this?" Richard sat frozen for a long moment, caught between the woman who had occupied a significant portion of his private life and the grandfather whose judgment he had never before openly questioned. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but final. "It is not my decision to overturn, Camille, and I am not certain, any longer, that I would wish to overturn it, even if it were." Camille's expression shifted from desperation to something colder, harder. She looked around the table once, at the guests, watching her, with expressions ranging from pity to poorly concealed satisfaction, before straightening her shoulders and walking from the room without another word, her heels striking sharply against the polished floor, until the sound faded into the hallway beyond. The silence that followed her departure stretched long and heavy. The Duke remained standing, though Elena could see the toll the confrontation had taken on him, a slight tremor in his hand as he steadied himself against the table. "I apologize for the disruption to this evening," he said finally, addressing the room at large, his voice regaining some of its earlier composure. "But I have lived long enough to understand that some truths cannot remain comfortable secrets forever, no matter how convenient their silence might be." He turned then, his gaze settling on Elena, who had remained still and composed throughout the entire exchange, watching everything unfold with careful attention. "There is one further matter I wish to address tonight," the Duke said, "while I still have the strength and the audience to address it properly." Elena felt her heart quicken, uncertain what was coming next. "For nearly a year," the Duke continued, "I have watched my grandson's wife conduct herself with a patience, intelligence, and integrity that this family has sorely lacked for several generations. She has uncovered financial mismanagement that would have gone unnoticed for years under less careful eyes. She has studied this family's affairs not out of ambition for herself, but out of genuine respect for the responsibility this inheritance carries. She has endured circumstances in this household that no young woman should ever have been forced to endure, and she has done so without bitterness, without cruelty, and without ever once losing her dignity." The room had turned its full attention toward Elena now, dozens of eyes watching her with an intensity she had never before experienced. She held herself steady, refusing to let the weight of the attention shake her composure. "I intend," the Duke said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "to place significant control of this family's core holdings, along with my personal trust, into Elena's care going forward. Not as a formality, and not as a temporary arrangement, but as a genuine transfer of responsibility to the person I believe is most capable of preserving what this family has built." A stunned murmur passed through the guests, followed by low, urgent whispers. Richard stared at his grandfather, then at Elena, his expression a complicated mixture of shock, something that might have been shame, and something else Elena could not immediately identify. "Richard," The Duke continued, turning to address his grandson directly. I do not say this to diminish you. You are my grandson, and I love you, whatever frustration I carry toward your choices. But this family's future requires more than birthright. It requires judgment you have not yet demonstrated, and character you have only recently begun to consider seriously. I am prepared to give you the opportunity to grow into the responsibility you were born into. But I will not gamble this family's future on potential alone, not when I have watched genuine capability prove itself in front of me for the past year. Richard said nothing, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him, unable or unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. The Duke turned back toward Elena, his expression softening slightly, the formal authority in his voice giving way to something quieter, more personal. She's mine to protect now, as she always should have been yours, he said, his gaze shifting briefly toward Richard, before returning to Elena. Whatever this family becomes going forward, it will be shaped, in significant part, by her judgment. I trust that judgment more than I have trusted anything in this family for a very long time. The dinner concluded shortly after, guests departing in quiet clusters, murmuring among themselves about the extraordinary evening they had just witnessed. Elena remained at the table long after most had left, sitting quietly beside the Duke as the candles burned lower, the weight of everything that had just occurred settling slowly over her. Are you well? The Duke asked, his voice gentler now that the room had emptied. I am not certain, Elena admitted honestly. I did not expect any of this. Not tonight, and not so completely. Change rarely announces itself gently, the Duke said, a tired but genuine warmth in his voice. But you have earned every part of what happened here tonight, Elena. Do not let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise. Across the room, Richard remained seated, staring at the space where Camille had once stood, then slowly, deliberately, lifting his gaze to meet Elena's. Whatever passed between them in that silent exchange, neither spoke of it immediately, but something had shifted, undeniably, in the room, in the household, and in the quiet, uncertain future that now stretched ahead of them both. Elena rose from the table finally, offering the Duke her arm to help him from the room, grateful, more than she could easily express, for a man who had seen something in her worth protecting, when almost no one else in this house had bothered to look closely enough to notice it at all. The estate felt different that night as she finally climbed the stairs to her room, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the departed guests. For the first time since her wedding day, Elena understood that whatever happened next in this house, she would not be facing it as someone waiting to be given a place within it. She would be facing it as someone who had already built one, brick by careful brick, entirely on her own. The morning after the dinner, the estate woke to the news that Camille's belongings had already been removed from the east wing, her room stripped bare, before most of the household had even risen for breakfast. Elena learned this from Mrs. Whitfield, who delivered the information with a quiet satisfaction she did not bother to hide. She left before dawn, the housekeeper said, setting a fresh pot of tea on the table in front of Elena. Took only what belonged to her, according to the staff who saw her go. I do not believe she will be returning. Elena absorbed the news quietly, feeling less triumph than she might have expected, and more a kind of tired relief, as though a weight she had carried so long she had nearly forgotten its presence, had finally, suddenly, lifted from her shoulders. Richard found her in the garden later that morning, standing near the same path where Camille had once delivered her sharp warnings beneath the guise of friendly advice. He approached slowly, his usual confidence noticeably absent, replaced by something more hesitant, more uncertain. "May I speak with you?" he asked, stopping a respectful distance away. Elena turned to face him, studying his expression carefully before answering. "Of course." Richard was quiet for a long moment, seeming to search for the right words among many he had likely rehearsed and discarded. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "Not a small one, not the kind that fixes everything with a single sentence, I know that." "No," Elena agreed quietly. "It does not fix everything. I married you knowing almost nothing about you," Richard continued, his voice carrying a weight Elena had rarely heard in it before. "I treated this marriage as an obligation to be endured rather than something worth building. I allowed Camille into this house, into our lives, without once considering what that choice would cost you. I have a great deal to answer for, Elena, and I understand, if forgiveness is not something you are prepared to offer easily, or perhaps at all. Elena considered his words carefully, weighing the honesty in them against the months of silence and humiliation that had preceded this moment. "I am not the same person who arrived at this house a year ago, Richard," she said finally. "I do not know if I can go back to being the wife you once expected, quiet and easily overlooked. I am not certain I would want to, even if I could." "I do not want that either," Richard said, more quickly than she expected. "I do not want the wife I once expected. I want—" He paused, seeming to search for words that did not come naturally to him. "I want the chance to know the woman my grandfather has spent the past year describing to me. The one who found the textile losses. The one who studied every ledger in this house until she understood it better than I do. The one who stood at that dinner table last night and did not flinch, not once, while an entire room watched her life change in front of them." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching for the calculation, the self-interest that had colored so many of Richard's previous interactions with her. She found, to her genuine surprise, something that felt closer to honest vulnerability, uncomfortable and unfamiliar on a man who had spent so long hiding behind careful distance. "I cannot promise you anything, Richard," she said finally. "Not forgiveness given freely, and certainly not trust restored quickly. Those things will have to be earned, the same way everything else in this house has had to be earned." "I understand," Richard said, and something in his posture suggested he genuinely did. "I am prepared to earn it, however long that takes." They did not resolve everything in that garden conversation, and Elena had no illusions that they would. But something had shifted between them, a door left open rather than firmly closed, and in the weeks that followed, Richard made a visible, consistent effort to walk through it. He began attending business meetings alongside Elena, rather than leaving her to navigate them independently. He asked her opinion on matters he once would have decided alone. He apologized, in small and large ways, for the months of coldness that had defined the early part of their marriage, never expecting the apologies to erase what had come before, but offering them anyway, consistently, as though understanding that consistency itself was a form of proof. The Duke's health continued its slow decline through the following months, though he remained sharp and engaged in the family's affairs for as long as his strength allowed. He spent considerable time with Elena during this period, formalizing the transfer of authority he had announced at the dinner, working closely with Mr. Cole to ensure the arrangements would hold firm regardless of what came after his passing. "You have exceeded everything I hoped for when I first began testing you," he told her one afternoon, several weeks after the dinner, as they reviewed documents together in his study. "I do not say that lightly, Elena. I have watched a great many people pass through this family over the decades. Few have earned my respect the way you have. I would not have found any of this without you," Elena said honestly. "You gave me a chance no one else in this house was willing to give." "I gave you an opportunity," the Duke corrected gently. "What you built with it was entirely your own doing." He set down the papers in his hands and studied her with an expression that carried both pride and a quiet, tired sadness. "I do not know how much time remains to me, child, but I find myself facing that uncertainty with far less fear than I once expected, knowing this family's future rests in hands as capable as yours." The formal transfer of authority was completed quietly over the following weeks. Documents signed and witnessed, the family's core holdings and the Duke's personal trust, legally placed under Elena's management, with Richard positioned alongside her rather than above her, a partnership neither of them had anticipated when their marriage first began. The household staff adjusted to the new arrangement with a warmth that surprised Elena at every turn. Mrs. Whitfield, who had shown Elena quiet kindness from the very first day, became something closer to a trusted advisor, offering guidance on matters both practical and personal, with a familiarity that had grown naturally over the difficult months they had weathered together. Henry, the once formal butler, greeted her each morning with genuine warmth rather than careful distance. Even the younger staff, who had once watched Elena with cautious pity, now approached her with a respect that felt entirely earned rather than simply granted by circumstance. Elena threw herself fully into her new responsibilities, applying the same careful discipline that had once helped her uncover the textile losses to every aspect of the family's holdings. She expanded the shipping business into new markets, that Richard's more cautious approach had previously overlooked. She restructured the textile operation, implementing careful oversight that ensured the mismanagement she had once uncovered could never quietly repeat itself. She approached each decision with the patience and thoroughness the Duke had once praised in her, never rushing, never assuming, always seeking to understand fully before acting. Richard, for his part, continued the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding trust, both within their marriage and within himself. He took on responsibilities he had once avoided, engaging with the family's affairs with a seriousness Elena had never witnessed in the early months of their marriage. He did not attempt to reclaim the authority the Duke had transferred to Elena, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that such authority had never truly been his to reclaim in the first place, not through birthright alone. Their relationship grew slowly, carefully, built on the kind of honest foundation that had been entirely absent when they first married. Elena did not rush toward forgiveness, and Richard did not expect it of her. Instead, they built something new between them, day by day, conversation by conversation, a partnership rooted in mutual respect rather than obligation or arrangement. It was nearly a year after the dinner that had changed everything, when Elena found herself standing once again in the garden, this time with Richard beside her, rather than Camille's sharp warnings hanging in the air. The estate around them had changed considerably in the months since, its business affairs stronger and more carefully managed than they had been in a generation, its household staff united by a genuine respect for the woman who had earned her place among them through effort rather than circumstance. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Richard asked quietly, watching the late afternoon light settle golden over the garden's careful rows. "When you arrived here as a stranger, and I could not even manage to look you in the eyes?" "Often," Elena admitted. "It feels like it belonged to someone else's life." "In many ways, I suppose it did," Richard said. "I am not the same man who married you that day. I hope you can see that, even if you are not yet prepared to fully trust it." Elena considered his words carefully, feeling the weight of everything that had passed between them, the humiliation and silence of those early months slowly giving way, over time, to something that felt genuinely different, genuinely earned. "I see it," she said finally. "I am beginning to trust it, Richard, slowly, but I am beginning." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the light shift across the gardens that had once felt like a prison, and now felt, increasingly, like something closer to home. Elena thought, in that quiet moment, of the frightened 17-year-old who had once stood at that altar, given away to settle a debt she had no part in creating, married to a man who could not spare her a single glance. That girl had disappeared somewhere in the months and years that followed, replaced gradually by a woman who had built her own place in a world that had never intended to make room for her. She had not been given power. She had not been given respect, or authority, or a genuine place within this family. She had earned every single piece of it, brick by careful brick, through patience and discipline, and a refusal to break beneath circumstances that would have broken many others. Whatever came next in her life, whatever challenges the estate's future still held, whatever remained uncertain in her slowly rebuilding marriage, Elena understood, standing in that garden with the golden evening light settling around her, that she was no longer someone waiting to be given a life worth living. She had built one herself, and for the first time since she was 17 years old, standing in front of a mirror in a dress that felt like a costume belonging to someone else, Elena finally recognized the woman staring back at her. She was, at last, entirely her own. 2 years after the dinner that changed the course of the Ashford family, Duke Edmund Ashford passed away quietly in his sleep, in the same study where he had spent countless evenings teaching Elena the careful workings of a family he had spent his entire life protecting. Elena was the one who found him the following morning, seated peacefully by the cold fireplace, a book still open in his lap, as though he had simply drifted off in the middle of a familiar routine. The grief that followed was quiet but deep, settling over the household like a heavy fog that took weeks to fully lift. Elena had lost, in the Duke, the only person in that house who had believed in her from the very beginning, who had seen something worth protecting in a frightened 17-year-old when no one else had bothered to look closely enough. She carried that loss privately, finding comfort in the work he had trusted her to continue, understanding that the truest honor she could offer his memory was to prove, every single day, that his faith in her had not been misplaced. The funeral drew relatives from across the country, distant cousins and business associates Elena had never met, all gathered to pay respects to a man whose influence had shaped a family empire spanning 3 generations. It was during this gathering that the first real challenge to Elena's authority emerged, arriving in the form of Charlotte Ashford, Richard's cousin, a sharp-eyed woman who had spent years quietly resentful of a family fortune she believed should have been distributed more evenly among blood relatives. "It seems strange," Charlotte remarked at the gathering following the funeral, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear, "that an outsider should hold such significant control over this family's affairs, while actual Ashfords by blood find themselves standing on the outside looking in." Elena, standing nearby with Richard, felt the familiar tightening in her chest that once would have made her retreat into careful silence. But 2 years of managing the family's business affairs, of navigating boardrooms and difficult negotiations, had taught her a different kind of composure than the one she had first learned in that cold, unwelcoming house. "The Duke's decisions were made with full legal counsel and considerable thought," Elena said calmly, meeting Charlotte's gaze directly. "I would be happy to discuss the reasoning behind them, if you have genuine questions, rather than simple grievances." Charlotte's eyes narrowed, clearly unprepared for such a direct response. "Perhaps you misunderstand my meaning," she said stiffly. "I understand it perfectly," Elena replied, her voice steady and unhurried. "You believe blood alone should determine authority in this family." The Duke believed differently, and he spent the final years of his life ensuring his wishes were documented clearly enough that they could not be easily challenged. "I would advise against testing that documentation, Charlotte. It is considerably stronger than you might expect." The exchange ended there, though Elena understood it would not be the last challenge she faced. In the weeks following the funeral, Charlotte attempted to contest portions of the Duke's will through legal channels, arguing that the transfer of authority to Elena represented an improper exercise of the Duke's judgment in his declining health. Mr. Cole, who had anticipated exactly this kind of challenge, produced years of careful documentation, medical assessments confirming the Duke's full mental clarity throughout the process, and detailed records of Elena's demonstrated competence that made the challenge appear increasingly weak with each passing week. Richard stood firmly beside Elena throughout the legal proceedings, a support that would have seemed impossible in the early months of their marriage, but now felt as natural as breathing. "My grandfather chose wisely," he told the family's lawyers during one particularly tense meeting, when Charlotte's legal team attempted to paint Elena's authority as an exploitation of an elderly man's affection. "I would not stand beside a decision I believe to be flawed, whatever personal cost that decision carries for my own inheritance." The legal challenge was ultimately dismissed, the court finding no evidence of impropriety in the Duke's carefully documented decisions. Charlotte withdrew from the family's affairs entirely afterward, her attempt to reclaim authority through blood alone having failed against the weight of demonstrated competence and careful preparation. With the challenge resolved, Elena and Richard settled into the steady rhythm of managing a family empire that had grown stronger and more stable under their combined leadership than it had been in years. Elena expanded the family's holdings into new territories, applying the same careful discipline that had first uncovered the textile losses to every new venture the family pursued. Richard, having fully embraced his role as a genuine partner rather than a distant figurehead, handled the family's relationships with longtime business associates, his natural charm finally paired with the seriousness and accountability that had been missing in the early years of their marriage. Their partnership deepened over time, built on a foundation neither of them could have imagined when their marriage first began, as a cold arrangement forced upon 2 strangers. The trust Elena had once withheld so carefully grew slowly into something genuine, earned through years of consistent effort, rather than empty promises. Richard, for his part, never stopped acknowledging the harm his early neglect had caused, never expecting his years of changed behavior to erase what had come before, but offering that acknowledgement as a foundation for the relationship they continued building together. 3 years after the Duke's passing, Elena gave birth to a daughter, whom she and Richard named Margaret, after Richard's grandmother, a woman Elena had never met, but whose memory the Duke had always spoken of with deep affection. Elena held her daughter for the first time in the same estate that had once felt like a prison, surrounded by staff who had become genuine friends over the years. in a marriage that had transformed entirely from the cold arrangement it had once been. "She will grow up knowing a very different house than the one you first arrived in," Richard said quietly, watching Elena hold their daughter in the soft afternoon light of the nursery. "She will grow up knowing that a house is only as strong as the people willing to fight for what belongs inside it," Elena replied, looking down at her daughter's peaceful face. "I intend to make certain she understands that early." The Ashford estate, once a place of quiet cruelty and careful humiliation, had become something entirely different under Elena's steady guidance. The staff who had once watched a frightened young bride navigate an impossible situation now watched a confident, respected leader manage a thriving family empire with the same patience and integrity that had first caught the Duke's attention so many years earlier. Mrs. Whitfield, who had shown Elena kindness from the very first day, remained a trusted advisor throughout the years, watching with quiet pride as the frightened girl she had first welcomed grew into a woman capable of shaping an entire family's future. Elena often thought back to that first night in the estate, sitting alone by her window, wondering what kind of life awaited her inside those cold, unfamiliar walls. She could not have imagined, in that moment, the journey that lay ahead of her, the humiliation she would endure, the strength she would discover within herself, and the life she would ultimately build through nothing but her own patient, determined effort. She thought, too, of the promise she had made herself that first night, that whatever came next, she would meet it standing up straight. She had kept that promise, through every difficult month that followed, through Camille's careful cruelty and Richard's cold distance, through the slow, patient work of earning a place in a family that had never intended to make room for her. Standing now in the nursery, her daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, surrounded by a household that had become genuinely her own, Elena understood that she had not simply survived the life she had been given. She had transformed it entirely, building something real and lasting from circumstances that had once seemed designed to break her. The Duke's final words to her echoed often in her memory, a promise he had made in front of an entire room of witnesses on the night everything changed. "She's mine to protect now, as she always should have been yours." Elena understood now, years later, that the Duke's protection had never been about shielding her from difficulty. It had been about giving her the opportunity to prove exactly what she was capable of, and then stepping back to watch her build something extraordinary with that chance. She had built it, and she intended to spend the rest of her life making certain that everything she had earned, every hard-won piece of respect and authority and genuine partnership, remained exactly what it had always been meant to be, entirely, unshakably, her own.